What if the most famous name in tequila belonged to a man who vanished from history the moment he became most powerful? Most who speak his name assume it is a brand, a label, a clever piece of marketing invented by some agency in a foreign city. They are wrong. José Cuervo was real. He lived. He built an empire from the volcanic soil of Jalisco. And when he died, the circumstances were never fully explained. Before we continue, if you are finding value in these explorations into hidden histories, consider subscribing as we work toward our first 1,000. It means more than you know. Now, back to the valley. The year was 1921. Mexico City in winter carries a particular quality of stillness, especially in the early hours before dawn, when the jacarandas stand motionless against the gray sky and the streets remain empty of vendors and their carts. In a private residence not far from the Zócalo, José Cuervo Labastida lay in bed, his condition deteriorating by the hour. He had arrived in the capital days earlier, traveling from Guadalajara to meet with his brother Carlos, who had recently been elected to Congress. The purpose of that journey was political counsel. José understood the risks that came with public office in a nation still bleeding from revolution. He had survived those years himself, barely, and he intended to pass along what he had learned about discretion, about knowing when to speak and when to disappear. The brothers dined together. What they ate remains unrecorded. What is known is that both men fell ill shortly afterward. Carlos would recover. José would not. His condition worsened steadily over several days. The diagnosis offered by physicians was pneumonia, a respectable cause of death for a man of 52, one that raised no immediate suspicions and required no investigation. The body was prepared for transport back to Jalisco. The funeral was held quietly. The newspapers printed brief notices, and then, almost immediately, silence. But in the decades that followed, a different account would emerge, spoken in low tones among those who had known the family, passed from one generation to the next, like an heirloom that no one wanted to display. The rumor was this: José Cuervo had not died of pneumonia. He had been poisoned, not deliberately, not as the intended target, but accidentally, caught in an assassination attempt meant for his brother. If true, the irony would have been profound. A man who had spent the most violent years of the Mexican Revolution cultivating the art of strategic invisibility, who had evaded Pancho Villa's death warrants, who had watched rivals shot in the streets of Tequila while he remained untouched, killed by a meal he should never have shared. The official record offers no confirmation. The family archives, famously guarded, provide no clarity. What exists instead is a documentary absence, the kind that accumulates around figures who preferred shadows to sunlight. And so the question lingers, unanswered across more than a century. What truly happened in those final days in Mexico City? What secrets died with the man whose name would outlive him in ways he could never have imagined? To understand, one must go back further. One must return to the valley where it all began, to the red-walled distillery that still stands on the main street of Tequila, to the fields of blue agave that stretch toward the volcano like an endless silver sea. One must trace the line from José Cuervo Labastida back through the generations, through the marriages and deaths and land deals that built an empire from a royal decree issued more than a century before his birth. The story begins not with the man, but with the land itself. In 1758, King Ferdinand VI of Spain granted a parcel of land in the region of Tequila, Jalisco, to a man named José Antonio de Cuervo y Valdés. It was not the largest grant issued that year, nor the most strategically valuable. The land was remote, the terrain volcanic, the summers punishing. But José Antonio saw something others did not. The blue agave grew wild on those slopes, its silvery leaves catching the light like rows of frozen fire. The indigenous people of the region had long fermented its juices into a drink they called mezcal, And José Antonio understood, perhaps before anyone else in his social class, that there was a fortune waiting in that ancient process, if only one had the patience to cultivate it. What he built was modest by later standards, a small operation, a taberna, a beginning. What his descendants would build from it would reshape the economy of an entire state, survive a revolution, and eventually conquer the drinking habits of the entire world. But those triumphs were still far away in 1758. The Spanish crown still ruled. The war for independence had not yet been imagined, and in the valley of Tequila, a family was just beginning to sink its roots into the red volcanic earth, unaware of the empire that would one day bear their name. The valley of Tequila sits at the foot of a volcano. This is not metaphor. The Volcán de Tequila rises more than 9,000 feet above the surrounding plains, dormant but not forgotten, its slopes covered in the mineral-rich soil that would make the region famous. The agave thrives in this terrain precisely because of what the volcano left behind: layers of volcanic ash and obsidian that drain quickly after the summer rains, forcing the plants to push their roots deep into the earth in search of moisture. The result is a concentration of sugars in the heart of the plant, the piña, that exists nowhere else in quite the same way. The Cuervo family understood this. They had centuries to learn. José Antonio de Cuervo y Valdés died in 1764, leaving his lands and his modest distilling operation to his sons. The eldest, José Prudencio, proved to be a meticulous businessman. Where his father had planted agave, José Prudencio planted more. Where his father had negotiated small purchases of neighboring plots, José Prudencio negotiated larger ones. By the end of the 1770s, he had consolidated a significant portion of the valley's most productive land under his control. He personally oversaw the distillation process, filling barrels with his own hands, maintaining a level of quality control that his competitors could not match. But the Spanish crown still loomed over every decision. In 1785, King Charles III banned the production of all alcoholic beverages in New Spain, hoping to force colonists to purchase imported Spanish wines and brandies. The distilleries went dark. The agave fields continued to grow, untended, waiting. The ban lasted 7 years. When Charles III died and his successor lifted the prohibition in 1792, the Cuervo family was ready. José María Guadalupe de Cuervo, the youngest son of the founder, petitioned the new king for something unprecedented: an official license to produce and distribute mezcal wine commercially. In 1795, King Charles IV granted the request. It was the first such permit ever issued in the Americas. The document still exists, preserved in the family archives, the ink faded but legible, the royal seal still visible. With that single piece of paper, the Cuervo family transformed from farmers into industrialists. The taberna became La Rojeña. The local drink became an export. And the name Cuervo began its long migration from a family surname to something larger. But empires are fragile things, especially in the colonies of dying monarchies. In 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang the bells of his church in Dolores and called for Mexican independence from Spain. The war that followed would last 11 years and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The Tequila Valley did not escape the violence. Armies marched through on their way to Guadalajara. Haciendas were burned. Workers fled to join the insurgency or simply to survive. The Cuervo family did what they had always done. They adapted. They paid tribute to whichever army controlled the region at any given moment. They maintained relationships with both royalists and insurgents. They kept the distillery running when others shuttered their doors. When Mexico finally won its independence in 1821, La Rojeña was still standing, one of the only operations in the valley that had survived intact. José María Guadalupe did not live to see independence. He died in 1805, leaving his holdings to his son and daughter, José Ignacio Faustino and María Magdalena. It was Maria Magdalena who would prove decisive. In 1810, she married Vicente Albino Rojas, a man of considerable ambition and limited sentimentality. When Maria Magdalena died just 5 years later, Vicente inherited control of the distillery. He promptly renamed it after himself, La Rojeña, a derivation of his surname. The Cuervo name temporarily disappeared from the operation, though the family bloodline continued through other branches. Vicente modernized the facilities, expanded production, and positioned the company to dominate the post-independence market. When he died in 1868, he left the business to his daughters, who in turn handed management to a man named Jesús Flores. Flores was not a Cuervo by blood, but he understood the business as well as any family member. He owned 2 other distilleries in the region, La Floreña and La Constancia, and he recognized that consolidation was the key to survival in an increasingly competitive market. Under his leadership, La Rojeña became the first tequila producer to bottle its product in glass vessels, hand-blown damajuanas wrapped in agave fiber, easier to transport than wooden barrels, and far more appealing to consumers. The innovation seems modest by modern standards. At the time, it was revolutionary. Flores also oversaw the first exports to the United States, shipping 3 bottles across the border in 1873. 3 bottles, the beginning of everything that would follow. Jesús Flores died in the 1890s. His widow, Ana González Rubio, inherited La Rojeña and found herself in need of a manager. She found one in a young man from a cadet branch of the original Cuervo family, a quiet, well-educated figure who had been working at one of the smaller distilleries on the edge of town. His name was José Cuervo Labastida. In 1900, Ana married him. The Cuervo name returned to the distillery after decades of absence, and the empire entered its most dangerous and transformative chapter. José Cuervo Labastida was not born into wealth. This is perhaps the most important detail of his early life, and the one most often overlooked. His branch of the Cuervo family had lost everything decades earlier. His father's business had failed. Debts had accumulated. When his parents died, the family holdings were sold at auction to cover what was owed. The buyer was Zenobio Souza, the patriarch of their fiercest rival, a man who had spent years acquiring the lands and distilleries that the Cuervos had once controlled. José watched his inheritance disappear into the hands of his family's enemy. He was left with nothing but a name, and the knowledge of what that name had once meant. He found work managing a small distillery owned by a distant relative, Jesús Flores. The position was modest, the pay unremarkable, but it allowed him entry into a world he had been born to occupy. He learned the business from the ground up, the rhythm of the agave harvest, the chemistry of fermentation, the precise temperatures required for proper distillation. He developed a reputation for competence and discretion. When Jesús Flores died, and his widow Ana found herself overwhelmed by the complexities of running the largest tequila operation in Mexico, she turned to the quiet young manager who had proven himself so reliable. Their marriage in 1900 was as much a business arrangement as a romantic union. Ana was older, wealthy, and in need of a partner who could navigate the changing world. José was ambitious, knowledgeable, and eager to reclaim the legacy his family had lost. The transformation began immediately. José understood that the tequila industry was entering a new era, one defined not by tradition, but by technology. He had visited the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904, walking the exhibition halls with the careful attention of a man taking notes. What he saw there changed everything. Machine-made bottles, electric lighting, telegraph systems that could transmit orders across continents in minutes. He returned to tequila with a vision. La Rojeña would become the most modern distillery in Latin America, or it would be left behind. The railroad came first. José lobbied the government for years, arguing that a rail line connecting tequila to Guadalajara would benefit the entire region. When the politicians proved slow, He financed portions of the construction himself. The tracks were laid alongside new telegraph poles and then electrical lines, bringing power to a town that had operated by candlelight and gaslight for centuries. José built a new bandstand in the central plaza, paved the cobblestone streets with obsidian from the volcano, installed running water in private homes. He was not merely building a company, he was building a kingdom. By 1910, La Rojena had grown into something unprecedented. The company controlled more than 4 million agave plants spread across dozens of estates: Santa Teresa, Camichines, Santa Ana, Las Cuevas, La Camotera, Los Colgados, La Fundición, El Colorado, and many others. The distillery employed hundreds of workers. The tequila produced there had won gold medals at international expositions in Madrid and Paris. José Cuervo had become, in the space of a single decade, one of the most powerful men in Jalisco, perhaps in all of Mexico. But power in Mexico during those years was a dangerous thing to hold. President Porfirio Díaz had ruled the country since 1877, maintaining order through a combination of modernization and repression. Foreign investors had flooded into Mexico, buying mines and railroads and oil fields, extracting wealth while the majority of the population remained in poverty. The hacendados, the great landowners, had grown rich, but the workers who tended their fields had grown restless. By 1910, the pressure had become unbearable. José Cuervo saw what was coming. He had always possessed an instinct for survival, a talent for reading the political winds before they shifted. He involved himself in state politics, cultivating relationships with both the old guard and the reformers. He was appointed Speaker of the Jalisco State Congress, a position that gave him influence over legislation affecting the tequila industry. He supported Díaz publicly while quietly preparing for his fall. When Francisco Madero launched his revolution in November 1910, José did not flee or resist. He waited, he watched, he calculated. The violence came to tequila in waves. Revolutionary armies and federal troops passed through the valley, requisitioning supplies, conscripting workers, burning fields. The Sauza distillery was attacked. Other producers saw their operations destroyed entirely. But La Rojena remained standing, protected by a combination of strategic payments, political connections, and José's carefully cultivated reputation for neutrality. He was not a partisan, he was a businessman. He would work with whoever held power, as his ancestors had done during the wars of independence a century earlier. This approach served him well until 1914, when the revolution fractured into competing factions and neutrality became impossible. In the summer of 1914, the revolution turned against José Cuervo. The details remain disputed, fragmented across contradictory accounts and family memories that do not always align. What is certain is this: Pancho Villa's Division del Norte was advancing south toward Guadalajara, and someone had given Villa reason to believe that José Cuervo was an enemy of the revolution. The charge was treason. The sentence, if Villa's forces reached him, would be death. The accusation was not entirely unfounded. José had supported the Huerta government after the coup that overthrew Madero in 1913. It had seemed at the time like the pragmatic choice. Victoriano Huerta promised stability, order, a return to the conditions that had allowed business to flourish under Díaz. José was not alone in his support. Most of the hacendado class had rallied behind Huerta, hoping to preserve their estates and their way of life. But Huerta's government collapsed within 18 months, driven from power by the combined forces of Villa, Carranza, and Zapata. Those who had supported the old regime now found themselves marked. The night José fled Guadalajara has become the stuff of family legend. According to accounts passed down through his niece Guadalupe, he received word that Villa's men were coming for him just hours before they arrived. He gathered what valuables he could carry, mounted his horse, and rode into the darkness. At some point during that desperate flight, the horse began to falter, its hooves cracked and bleeding from the rocky terrain. José stopped, pulled a bottle of tequila from his saddlebag, and poured the liquor into the animal's nostrils, an old folk remedy believed to ease equine pain and restore energy. Whether the remedy worked or the horse simply found reserves of strength, they continued on. José disappeared into the countryside and did not resurface for months. Where he went during that period of hiding remains unclear. Some accounts suggest he crossed into the United States, waiting out the worst of the violence from the safety of Texas. Others claim he remained in Mexico, moving between safe houses maintained by allies and business partners who owed him favors. The family archives offer no definitive answer. What they do reveal is that José maintained contact with La Rojeña even while in hiding, sending instructions through intermediaries, ensuring that production continued despite his absence. The distillery was too valuable to abandon, too central to the regional economy for any faction to destroy without consequence. By 1915, the revolutionary coalition had fractured completely. Villa and Carranza, once allies, were now at war with each other. The violence intensified. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Guadalajara was burned, bombarded, its citizens caught between armies that showed little mercy. The tequila industry nearly collapsed. Agave fields were torched. Workers were conscripted or killed. Distilleries that had operated for generations went silent. It was during this period of maximum chaos that José Cuervo made perhaps his most consequential decision. He proposed a union of tequila makers. The idea was radical. The great families of the valley, the Cuervos, the Sauzas, the others, had been rivals for generations, competing fiercely for land, workers, and markets. The hatred between some of them ran deep, rooted in decades of stolen estates and broken agreements. But José understood that the revolution threatened them all equally. If they continued to fight each other while the country burned around them, none of them would survive. He suggested a temporary alliance, a cartel, structured along the lines of German industrial combinats he had read about, in which the major producers would fix prices, coordinate production, and share distribution networks. Competition would be suspended for the duration of the crisis. Survival would take precedence over profit. The negotiations were difficult. The Sauzas, in particular, resisted any arrangement that would benefit their old enemies. But the logic was undeniable. One by one, the major producers agreed to José's terms. The cartel took shape, the first of its kind in Mexican history, a prototype for the arrangements that would later define other industries in far darker ways. For the moment, it served its purpose. The tequila makers presented a united front. They pooled resources to protect their shipments. They coordinated payments to whichever army controlled the valley at any given moment, and they survived. José emerged from hiding sometime in 1916 or 1917, the precise date unrecorded. The worst of the violence had passed, though sporadic fighting would continue for years. He returned to La Rojeña and found it damaged but intact. The red walls still stood. The copper stills remained operational. The agave fields, though depleted, could be replanted. He set about rebuilding, applying the same energy and vision that had transformed the company before the war. But something had changed. The United States, watching the chaos in Mexico with growing alarm, had declared José Cuervo an enemy of the state. American intelligence officials believed that his railroad, the one he had built to transport tequila, could be used to move weapons and revolutionaries toward the border. They monitored his movements, intercepted his correspondence, and blocked his exports. The border that had once been so permeable, so profitable, was now closed to him. And then, in 1920, came Prohibition. The 18th Amendment transformed the landscape of American drinking overnight. On January 17, 1920, The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the United States. Breweries shuttered, distilleries went dark. Saloons that had operated openly for decades were padlocked by federal agents. And along the border with Mexico, a new economy emerged, one built on smuggling, bribery, and the insatiable American thirst for what it could no longer legally obtain. José Cuervo recognized the opportunity immediately. The same railroads he had built to transport tequila to Guadalajara could carry it north, toward the border towns where American buyers waited with cash in hand. The same networks of intermediaries and allies who had helped him survive the revolution could facilitate the movement of product across the Rio Grande. The legal market had closed, but the illegal one had opened wider than ever before. Tequila, which had been a regional curiosity in the United States, suddenly became valuable precisely because it was forbidden. The mechanics of cross-border smuggling during Prohibition remain only partially documented. The families involved had every reason to obscure their activities, and many records were deliberately destroyed. What is known is that tequila flowed north in enormous quantities during the 1920s, carried by mule trains across remote desert crossings, hidden in false compartments of trucks and rail cars, delivered to speakeasies from Texas to California. The profits were extraordinary. The risks were considerable. American enforcement officials, already suspicious of José Cuervo from his revolutionary-era activities, intensified their surveillance. Mexican authorities, many of whom were on the payroll of one producer or another, looked the other way. The cartel José had organized during the revolution proved useful once again. The major tequila families coordinated their smuggling operations, dividing territories, and sharing routes to avoid competition that might attract unwanted attention. They established relationships with American distributors, some legitimate businessmen looking to profit from Prohibition, others connected to the criminal organizations that were rapidly consolidating power in cities like Chicago and New York. The line between legal commerce and organized crime blurred, then disappeared entirely. Tequila became entangled with the same networks that moved whiskey, rum, and heroin across borders. José navigated this world with his characteristic caution. He avoided direct involvement in the most dangerous aspects of the trade, preferring to work through intermediaries who could be disavowed if necessary. He maintained his public image as a respectable businessman, a benefactor of his community, a man concerned only with the legitimate production of Mexico's national spirit. The smuggling operations were conducted at arm's length, their profits laundered through layers of shell companies and foreign accounts. If American investigators suspected his involvement, they could never prove it definitively. But the strain was showing. The revolution had aged José beyond his years. The constant maneuvering, the need to maintain relationships with corrupt officials on both sides of the border, the threat of violence from rivals and authorities alike, all of it extracted a toll. His health began to decline. He suffered from respiratory problems, possibly tuberculosis, possibly something else. The medical records from this period are sparse, filtered through family discretion and the limitations of early 20th century diagnosis. In January 1918, the business partnership between José and his brother Carlos was formally dissolved before a notary in Guadalajara. The reasons for this dissolution remain unclear. Some accounts suggest a falling out between the brothers over the direction of the company. Others indicate that José was simply consolidating control, preparing for whatever came next. Carlos would go on to pursue a political career, eventually winning election to the Mexican Congress. José would continue running La Rojeña, though with diminishing energy and increasing reliance on trusted subordinates. The year 1921 began with José in declining health, but still active in the business. He traveled to Mexico City in the early months of that year, partly for medical consultations, partly to meet with his brother Carlos. The political situation remained unstable. President Venustiano Carranza had been assassinated the previous year, replaced by Álvaro Obregón in an election that many considered fraudulent. Carlos, as a member of Congress, was navigating dangerous waters. José came to offer counsel, the same strategic advice that had kept him alive through a decade of revolution and upheaval. The brothers dined together on an evening in early 1921. The location was a private residence, the menu unrecorded. Within days, both men had fallen ill. Carlos recovered slowly over the following weeks. José did not recover at all. His condition deteriorated steadily, the respiratory symptoms worsening despite the attention of physicians. He died in Mexico City, far from the valley that had made his fortune, far from the red walls of La Rojeña that bore his family's legacy. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia. The unofficial story, whispered among those who knew the family, suggested something darker. The rumor of poison has never been confirmed. It exists in the space between documented history and family memory, passed down through generations like an inheritance no one requested. What is known is that José Cuervo La Bastida died under circumstances that invited speculation, and that the family made no effort to investigate further. Perhaps they knew the truth and preferred to bury it. Perhaps they suspected and chose not to confirm. Perhaps the pneumonia was real, and the poison story was simply the kind of narrative that accumulates around powerful men who die at inconvenient moments. The documentary record offers no resolution. What the record does show is what happened next. Control of La Rojeña reverted to Ana González Rubio, José's widow, who found herself once again in charge of the empire she had inherited decades earlier. Ana was no longer young. She had been a widow once before, had married José when she was already past the age when most women of her class would have remarried. But she possessed the same practical intelligence that had led her to choose José in the first place. She understood that the company needed stability, continuity, a steady hand during the turbulent years that followed. The 1920s were profitable despite, or because of, prohibition. Tequila continued to flow north across the border, now carrying even higher premiums as American enforcement efforts intensified and supply became more constrained. La Rojeña expanded its production, replanting the agave fields that had been damaged during the revolution, hiring workers who had fled the violence and were now returning to the valley. The red walls of the distillery, which had survived so much, enclosed a thriving operation once again. But Mexico itself remained unstable. The Cristero War erupted in 1926, pitting the Catholic Church against the anti-clerical government of Plutarco Elias Calles. Jalisco was at the center of the conflict, a deeply Catholic region where resentment of federal religious policies ran deep. Villages were burned, priests were executed. Fighters on both sides committed atrocities that would haunt the national memory for generations. La Rojeña, located in the heart of this contested territory, navigated the violence as it had navigated every previous crisis, through discretion, through strategic payments, through the careful maintenance of relationships with all parties. Ana González Rubio died in 1934. She left no children of her own. Her marriage to José had produced no heirs. The estate passed instead to her niece, Guadalupe Gallardo, a woman who had grown up in the shadow of the Hacienda and understood its rhythms as intimately as anyone alive. Guadalupe would manage the company for more than 3 decades, guiding it through the end of Prohibition, through the Second World War, through the post-war boom that would transform tequila from a regional Mexican spirit into a global phenomenon. Under Guadalupe's leadership, José Cuervo became the dominant brand in the industry. The company that had once competed fiercely with Sauza now stood alone at the summit, its products distributed across the United States, Europe, and beyond. The margarita, that quintessential American cocktail, helped drive demand to unprecedented levels. By the 1940s and 1950s, José Cuervo was synonymous with tequila itself. the name on every bottle that mattered, the standard against which all others were measured. Guadalupe died in 1966, leaving the estate to her sister Virginia. One of Virginia's sons, Juan Beckman Gallardo, would take over management of the business, continuing the pattern of family control that had persisted since the 18th century. The Beckman family remains in charge today, 6 generations removed from José Antonio de Cuervo y Valdés, the man who received the original land grant from a Spanish king in 1758. The continuity is remarkable. Empires rise and fall. Revolutions sweep away the old order. Wars destroy what took generations to build. Yet La Rojeña still stands on the main street of Tequila, its red walls maintained with the same care that José Cuervo Labastida devoted to them more than a century ago. The cobblestones he laid, cut from volcanic obsidian, still pave the streets of the town center. The bandstand he built still anchors the central plaza. The railroad he financed still carries visitors from Guadalajara, though now they come as tourists rather than traders. The family has guarded its privacy with the same vigilance that José himself cultivated. The archives remain largely closed to outside researchers. The internal histories emphasize triumphs and innovations while passing quickly over the darker chapters, the revolution, the smuggling, the deaths that remain unexplained. When Ted Genoese, the journalist who would eventually write the first comprehensive biography of José Cuervo, sought access to family documents, he encountered resistance at every turn. It took years of relationship building, of demonstrating trustworthiness, before the doors began to open even partially. What he found confirmed what the silence had always suggested, that the story of the Cuervo family was far more complicated than the brand mythology allowed. That José Cuervo Labastida was not simply a visionary entrepreneur, but a political operator, a survivor, a man who built an empire through methods that could not always bear scrutiny. That the legacy he left behind was preserved not through transparency, but through careful control of the narrative, the same instinct for strategic invisibility that had kept him alive through a decade of revolution. Today, more than a century after José Cuervo Labastida's death, the town of Tequila receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. They arrive on the José Cuervo Express, a tourist train that departs from Guadalajara and winds through the blue agave fields that stretch to the horizon like an ocean frozen in silver. They tour La Rojeña, the oldest continuously operating distillery in Latin America, walking through rooms where copper stills have produced tequila since before Mexican independence. They sample aged reserves in the private cellars, purchase bottles wrapped in commemorative packaging, and pose for photographs beneath the archways that José built when electricity first came to the valley. The landscape itself has been recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. The agave landscape and ancient industrial facilities of Tequila, a designation that acknowledges both the natural beauty of the region and its historical significance. The volcano still rises in the distance, dormant and watchful. The soil remains rich with the minerals that make the blue agave thrive. The families that have cultivated this land for generations continue their work, though now under the umbrella of a global corporation that sells millions of cases annually across more than 100 countries. José Cuervo the brand has become something separate from José Cuervo the man. The name appears on bottles in airports and supermarkets, in bars and restaurants, in songs and films and advertisements that celebrate tequila as a symbol of Mexican identity and American indulgence. Few who drink it know that the name belonged to a real person. Fewer still know anything of his life, the lost inheritance, the strategic marriage, the empire built through modernization and political calculation, the flight from Pancho Villa, the death that may or may not have been what it seemed. This is perhaps what José would have wanted. He spent his life cultivating invisibility, preferring to operate in shadows, while others stood in the light. He understood that power is most secure when it cannot be seen, when it works through intermediaries and institutions rather than individuals. The name on the bottle endures. The man behind it has been forgotten. The empire continues, generation after generation, its foundations buried beneath layers of corporate mythology and family silence. The red walls of La Rojena still stand. The agave still grows on the volcanic slopes. The trains still run from Guadalajara, carrying visitors who come seeking the romance of tequila without knowing its history. And somewhere in the family archives, in documents that may never be fully opened to public view, the truth of what happened in Mexico City in 1921 remains, waiting perhaps for a future generation to decide whether some secrets are better left undisturbed. The valley keeps what it knows. It always has.